The woman stepping off the afternoon train at Caldwell, Kansas in the autumn of 1882, had 3 lies already formed behind her teeth before her boot heel even touched the depot platform. She wore a pale blue traveling dress that was slightly too fine for the dusty cattle town she had arrived in, and she carried a single leather valise that was slightly too light for a woman who had supposedly traveled all the way from St. Louis with every intention of staying. Her hair was pinned beneath a bonnet that she had purchased at the last stop, trading away the elegant silk one she had worn since boarding, because the silk bonnet had belonged to a leaner Ashworth, and a leaner Ashworth was the name she was leaving behind on the train like a shed skin. Here, in Caldwell, she was going to be Clara Mee Whitfield. She had rehearsed it on the journey. Clara Mee Whitfield was a schoolteacher of modest means and good reputation, traveling west to take a position that had been offered to her through a letter of correspondence with the local church. She had even forged the letter, which was tucked into the bodice of her dress, next to the small amount of cash she had left in the world, and the single photograph she could not bring herself to throw away, the one of her mother standing in front of a house in Cincinnati that no longer belonged to anyone named Ashworth. The platform was a scene of cheerful chaos. Cattle hands moved around her with their broad hats and sun-cracked faces. Porters hauled luggage on flat carts, and somewhere down the line, a horse was objecting loudly to the smell of the locomotive. A woman selling apple pies from a basket near the depot door called out her prices with cheerful persistence. Children ran between the legs of adults who were too absorbed in their reunions and departures to pay them much attention. Clara Mee Whitfield stood very still in the middle of all of it and breathed. She had not taken 2 steps toward the depot door when the man appeared. He was not remarkable at first glance. That was what she would think later, lying awake in the narrow bed of the boarding house, trying to understand how she had so thoroughly underestimated him. He was tall, certainly, with the kind of lean, sun-weathered build that came from genuine outdoor labor, rather than the affected sportsman's tan she had seen on wealthy men back east. His hat was brown and battered and pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested it had been pushed back 1,000 times before while he squinted at something in the distance. His jacket was plain canvas. His boots were working boots with actual mud on them, and the only concession he made to anything beyond pure function was the dark bandana knotted at his throat, which was a deep burgundy color that had faded unevenly along the fold lines. He was leaning against one of the depot's support posts with his arms crossed and his eyes moving across the platform with the unhurried patience of a man who was waiting for something specific and had made peace with the fact that it would arrive in its own time. His name was Colt Reeves, and he was 28 years old, and he had come to the Caldwell depot because his employer, old Dutch Harmon, who ran the Harmon cattle outfit 3 miles east of town, had received word that the church-sponsored schoolteacher they had helped fund and arrange was arriving on the afternoon train. Colt was not the sort of man Dutch usually sent to collect visitors. That job normally fell to the younger hands, the ones who were eager to get into town and who could be trusted to be polite and reasonably presentable. But the younger hands were all occupied with a fence line that had come down in the east pasture, and Dutch had pointed at Colt with a fork still in his hand from his breakfast and said, simply, "Colt, go fetch the teacher," in the tone of a man who expects to be obeyed without commentary. So Colt was here, and he was watching the passengers disembark, and when his eyes landed on the woman in the blue dress standing very still in the middle of the platform with that particular expression on her face, something in him went very quiet and very alert at the same time. She was not doing anything wrong exactly. She was just standing there. But there was something in the quality of her stillness that was wrong, the way she was holding herself too carefully, the way her eyes were moving across the crowd with a calculation that did not quite match the expression of mild, polite interest she had arranged on her features. He had spent enough time working cattle to know the difference between an animal at rest and an animal that was simply standing very still, and this woman was most emphatically the latter. He also noticed, because he was the kind of man who noticed things, that her bonnet was new. He could tell by the way the ribbon sat too stiffly at her jaw, the crease in the brim not yet softened by wear. Everything else about her traveling outfit suggested she had been on the road for some time. That small inconsistency lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. He uncrossed his arms and walked toward her. She saw him coming, and her expression shifted in a way that interested him considerably. She composed herself so quickly and so completely that most men would have missed the flicker of alarm, but Colt was not most men, and he had not missed it. "Miss Whitfield," he said, touching the brim of his hat. The name caused the smallest, nearly imperceptible hesitation. One heartbeat's worth of delay before she smiled and said, "Yes, that is me. You must be from the church committee." Her voice was educated. That was real. The accent was from further east than Kansas, Ohio, or thereabouts, and the vocabulary was natural and unhesitating. But she had answered to a name like a woman hearing an unfamiliar piece of music for the first time and making a point of following along correctly. "Colt Reeves," he said. "I work for Dutch Harmon. He sent me to bring you out to the ranch. The Reverend Alcott will want to see you in the morning, go over the arrangements for the schoolhouse." "That is very kind," she said. "I was not expecting to be collected." "You have more luggage." She glanced at the valise in her hand, and something moved across her face that he could not quite name. "Only this," she said. "I prefer to travel light." He looked at the valise. It was a fine piece of luggage, smooth leather with brass fittings, the kind that cost real money. A modest schoolteacher traveling from a modest existence in St. Louis would not have that particular valise. He said nothing about it. He simply reached out and said, "I will carry that for you." And when she handed it to him, he noticed the way she let go of it very carefully, as though she was making herself do it, as though letting it out of her hands required a conscious decision. "Thank you," she said. He led her to where he had hitched the wagon at the side of the depot. It was a working ranch wagon, nothing elegant, with a bench seat that had seen better decades and a horse named Priscilla, who was old and reliable, and had no interest whatsoever in making a good impression on anyone. The woman in the blue dress climbed up onto the wagon bench with a grace that suggested she had done it before, which was an interesting detail for a schoolteacher who had supposedly never been west of Missouri. He stored this observation alongside the others and clicked Priscilla into motion. They rode in silence for a little while. The late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the Kansas prairie, turning the dry grass to hammered gold, and the distant line of cottonwoods along the creek into dark green silhouettes that looked like ink pressed into the horizon. The woman sat straight back beside him and looked at it all with an expression he could not read, something that was not quite wonder and not quite sorrow but lived in the territory between them. "It is something, is it not?" he said, not making it a question. She looked at him. "It is very different from what I expected," she said carefully. "What did you expect?" "Something rougher, perhaps, more dangerous looking." "It is rougher and more dangerous than it looks," he said. "It has a way of presenting itself pleasantly and then surprising you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I imagine it does." He had the strong feeling that she was not talking about the landscape. He said, "Where did you teach before, Miss Whitfield?" "Back east." "Cincinnati," she said, and then stopped, as though realizing she had answered too quickly. He filed that away too. "Long journey from Cincinnati." "St. Louis first," she said, the correction coming just a fraction too smooth, the way a person sounds when they are remembering to say the right version of something rather than simply saying the true thing. "I spent some time in St. Louis before this." "And you decided to come west to teach?" "Yes." "That is a significant undertaking," he said mildly. "Not many women from Cincinnati would make that choice." "I'm not most women," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was completely unguarded and completely real, a flash of the actual person beneath the careful performance, and it was the most genuine thing she had said since he had found her on the platform. He almost smiled. He kept his face forward toward Priscilla's ears and the golden road ahead and said, "No, I do not imagine you are." The Harmon Ranch was a respectable operation, not the grandest spread in Sumner County but solid and well-maintained, with a main house of whitewashed lumber, 2 bunkhouses, a barn that had been added onto twice as the outfit had grown, and a kitchen garden that Mrs. Dutch Harmon, who was called me by everyone including her husband, tended with the devotion of a woman who had once known what it was like to go without fresh vegetables, and had resolved never to suffer that particular deprivation again. Me Harmon was a small woman of 50 with gray threaded through her brown hair and hands that were always busy with something. Currently they were busy wiping flour off her palms as she came to the door to greet their arriving guest. "Miss Whitfield," she said warmly. "We have been looking forward to your arrival. Come in, you must be worn through from the journey. Colt, bring her things." "Already got them, me," he said, setting the valise down inside the door. The woman who was calling herself Clara Me Whitfield stepped into the warmth of the Harmon kitchen, and some of the tension he had been watching her carry since the platform seemed to ease fractionally from her shoulders. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke and something with apples in it, and there were dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams, and the whole room had the particular quality of a space that had absorbed decades of ordinary human warmth. "You will stay here tonight," me said, settling her into a chair at the kitchen table with the efficiency of a woman who had managed a household of hungry men for 30 years and had never lost the instinct for hospitality. "The schoolhouse is in town and you will start Monday, but tonight you rest and eat and tomorrow Colt will drive you in to meet Reverend Alcott." "That is very generous," the woman said, and Colt noticed that she looked genuinely moved by the simple kindness of it. Whatever circumstances had brought her to be standing on that platform with a borrowed name and a new bonnet, she had not expected to be taken care of. He excused himself to tend to Priscilla and give me and their guests some privacy. He worked slowly in the barn, brushing Priscilla down with more thoroughness than strictly necessary, giving himself time to think. She was not Clara Me Whitfield. He was fairly certain of that. He was also fairly certain that she was not a school teacher, or at least had not been one recently. The hands were wrong. He had noticed them when she handed him the valise. Schoolteachers developed a particular callous pattern from chalk and managing children in cold classrooms. Her hands were soft and smooth in the wrong places, and there was a faint mark on her right hand's ring finger where a ring had been worn consistently for some time and recently removed. None of this made her a bad person. Plenty of people came west under names that did not quite belong to them. The frontier had always been a place where a person could attempt to become someone new. That was part of its promise and part of its peril. What made him careful was not what she was hiding. It was what she might be running from. He came back inside for supper, which me produced with her characteristic efficiency, a roast chicken with potatoes, and the apple thing which turned out to be a pie that could have made a man weep with gratitude. Dutch Harmon sat at the head of the table, a large, slow-moving man with a genuine goodness buried under decades of weather and hard work, and 2 of the younger ranch hands, Bobby Teal and a boy everyone called Skeeter for reasons lost to history, sat at the far end of the table and were on their best behavior because there was a woman present. She ate with good appetite, which pleased me visibly, and she answered Dutch's questions about St. Louis and the journey with poise and consistency. She was good at it. Colt ate his chicken and watched her, and thought that she had probably been performing for the benefit of difficult audiences for quite some time. After supper, Dutch and the boys drifted toward the sitting room, and me showed their guests to the small room off the kitchen that served as a guest accommodation, a narrow but clean space with a quilt on the bed, and a wash basin, and a good solid door that latched from the inside. Colt was washing up at the pump outside when me came to stand beside him with a lantern. "She is a pretty thing," me said, in the tone of a woman opening a conversation she intended to continue whether the other party was willing or not. "Yes," he said, There is something sad about her, though. Did you notice? I noticed some things, he said carefully. Me was quiet for a moment. Then she said, whatever it is, Colt, let her be. Everyone deserves a fresh start. He looked at her. Me had never been a woman to ignore the obvious without a reason. You think she is using a name that is not hers, he said. Me's expression did not change. I think, she said, that the Lord sees what is in a person's heart and judges accordingly, and that the rest of us might do well to follow his example rather than appoint ourselves as detectives. She picked up her lantern, and I think she is going to need a friend more than she needs a cross-examination. She went back inside, and Colt stood at the pump in the autumn dark with the stars coming out overhead, and he thought about that for a long time. In the morning he drove her into town, and it was a different kind of drive than the one the evening before. The light was different, and the woman beside him had slept and eaten Me's extraordinary breakfast, and she sat a little less rigidly than she had on the wagon seat the previous afternoon. She asked him questions about Caldwell, genuine questions, the kind a person asks when they are trying to understand a place rather than simply seem interested in it. He answered them honestly. He told her that Caldwell was a cattle town at the end of the Kisham Trail, and that it had a reputation for being rough during the trailing season, which was mostly behind them now, and that the permanent population was a good mix of people trying to build something real and people just passing through. He told her about the Reverend Alcott, who was originally from Massachusetts and had come west 15 years ago, and had never quite gotten over his initial alarm at the frontier, but had built a genuinely good congregation despite it. He told her about the schoolhouse, which had been built the previous spring by a volunteer effort of the whole community and smelled of new lumber still, which he personally considered one of the finer smells available to a human being. She listened carefully, and he could see her filing things away, building herself a map of the place she had landed, identifying exits and complications and opportunities the way a person does when they have recently learned that they need to pay attention to those things. You have questions you want to ask me, he said after a pause. She looked at him sideways. What makes you say that? You have been rehearsing something since we left the ranch, he said. There is a specific expression a person gets. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, is this a friendly town for a woman alone? He considered the question in all its dimensions before answering. It is a town, he said. There are friendly people in it and unfriendly people in it. A woman alone who minds her business and does her work and does not make enemies will generally be all right. He paused. Are you expecting someone to be looking for you? The question landed between them like a dropped stone. She held very still for exactly the amount of time it takes to make a decision. Then she said, that is a very direct question. I am a very direct person, he said. I apologize if it is intrusive. You do not have to answer. She looked at him for a long moment. He kept his eyes on the road, giving her the space of not being stared at while she made up her mind about him. I do not expect immediate trouble, she said finally. I may be being overly cautious. Better to be overly cautious than the alternative, he said. She almost laughed. He heard it in her exhale, the ghost of a laugh that got partly swallowed. My name, she said, is Eleanor Ashworth. He nodded slowly, keeping his voice even. Good morning, Eleanor, he said. I am still Colt. She looked at him with an expression that was half wariness and half something that might have been gratitude struggling to make itself known. You suspected, she said. From the platform, he said. The bonnet was new. The valise was too fine. You answered to the name like a person hearing a new piece of music. She closed her eyes briefly. I thought I was more convincing than that. You were very convincing, he said honestly. Anyone who was not paying particular attention would not have noticed anything out of place. And you pay particular attention. It is a habit I developed, he said. Comes from spending time in situations where missing things could get you killed. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I am not going to tell you everything, not yet. You do not owe me anything, Eleanor. The sound of her real name from his mouth made her expression do something complicated and brief, like light moving across water. "The letter of recommendation," she said carefully. "Is it going to be examined very closely?" "By Reverend Alcott." He thought about it. "He is a trusting man. He will read it for the content, not looking for holes, as long as you can actually teach." "I can actually teach," she said, with a quickness and certainty that was the most confident thing she had said yet. "That part is not a lie. I was a teacher. I have credentials. They are just under a different name." "Then you should be all right," he said. She let out a breath that suggested she had been holding a great deal of tension without realizing it. "Why are you being kind to me?" she said. "Most men would report a woman using a false name." He thought about me standing by the pump with her lantern. "Most men have not spent time thinking about what it costs a person to run," he said. "And I do not have any interest in making your situation harder than it already is." She looked at him, and he felt the weight of it, the full attention of a very intelligent woman who had learned to measure people very carefully. "Thank you," she said. It came out with more sincerity than she had probably intended. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "Thank me if it all works out." Reverend Alcott was a spare man with nervous hands and a genuinely warm heart, and he received Eleanor Ashworth, presented to him as Clara Me Whitfield, with the grateful enthusiasm of a man who had been trying to establish a proper school for 2 years and had begun to despair of it. He walked her through the schoolhouse with the pride of a father showing off a new child, and she responded to it with an enthusiasm that was completely genuine, moving through the freshly built room with her hand trailing along the desks, and asking good practical questions about the number of students expected, and their ages, and what resources had been assembled. Colt stood in the doorway and watched. She was good with people. That was obvious. She had a quality that Reverend Alcott was already responding to without knowing why, a focused attention when he spoke that made a person feel that what they were saying was interesting and important, and a way of framing her own responses that was warm without being performative. She caught him watching her at one point and held his gaze for exactly a second before looking back at the Reverend with a small smile that he felt somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum. He was in trouble. He was aware of it with the philosophical resignation of a man who has recognized a hazard on the trail ahead and knows he is going to ride toward it anyway. She moved into the boarding house in town that same afternoon, run by a widow named Mrs. Grundy, which was an unfortunate name that did not suit her at all because she was a cheerful, broad-faced woman who smelled of lavender and had an absolute refusal to allow any nonsense in her establishment. The room she gave Eleanor was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the main street, which Eleanor decided immediately was an asset in terms of being aware of who came and went. The school began the following Monday, and Caldwell's children descended on the new schoolhouse with a combination of excitement and suspicion that Eleanor handled with complete mastery. By the end of the first week, she had established order, genuine affection from most of the children, a firm but fair reputation with the parents, and the beginnings of an actual curriculum that was more ambitious than the community had expected. Colt heard about it from Dutch, who had heard about it from me, who had been talking to Mrs. Alcott, who had been talking to half the town. He came into Caldwell on the Friday of her second week on a legitimate errand for Dutch, needing to pick up wire and salt and a few other supplies, and he was loading the wagon at the general store when he heard her voice and turned to find her at the store counter, making purchases of her own. She was in a lighter dress than the traveling outfit, a practical gray wool that suited the October weather and the work she was doing, and she had her hair differently, less formally pinned, and she looked more herself this way, he thought, whoever herself actually was. She saw him at the same moment, and her expression did the thing he was beginning to recognize, the brief, involuntary warmth that appeared before she had time to decide how much warmth was appropriate. "Mr. Reeves," she said. "Miss Whitfield," he said, because they were in public and the name was hers here, and he wanted her to know he understood that. She paid for her purchases and he held the door for her, and they walked out onto the wooden sidewalk together in the natural way of two people who are heading in the same direction. "How is the school going?" he asked. "Better than I could have hoped," she said, and the genuine pleasure in her voice was lovely. "The children are extraordinary. Earnest and capable and hungry for it, most of them. There is a girl named Ruth who is going to be formidable. Mark my words, that child will be running something significant by the time she is 25. He smiled. "I believe you." "And you," she said. "How is the ranch?" "The fence that was down is fixed. Priscilla threw a shoe and has not forgiven me for having the farrier out. We are getting ready for winter." She smiled at that, the first fully unguarded smile he had seen from her, and it was something to see. "You speak of Priscilla as though she has opinions," she said. "Priscilla has a great many opinions," he said. "She simply cannot express them in words, which saves everyone a great deal of time." She laughed. There it was, the real laugh, and it was exactly what he had expected and somehow more than he had expected at the same time. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk with the autumn sun warm on their faces and the noise of Caldwell around them, and neither of them seemed to be in a hurry to move on. "I want to show you something," he said. "Are you engaged this afternoon?" She looked at him with the careful measuring quality that had not entirely left her, and he did not look away from it or try to soften the directness of his own gaze. "I have no plans," she said. He had Priscilla and the wagon, which was fully loaded now with Dutch's wire and salt, and not particularly conducive to a scenic drive. But the errand was done, and Dutch had not specified a time for his return. So Colt drove a leaner south out of town along the creek road to a spot where the cottonwoods grew thickest, and the creek widened into a pool that caught the afternoon light in a way that he had always privately considered one of the finer sights available in Sumner County. She sat beside him in the wagon and looked at it with a silence that was the good kind of silence, the kind that comes from being genuinely moved rather than having nothing to say. "Dutch brought his family here when I was 17, he said after a while. "I had been working for him for about 6 months, and I had come from a situation that was not very good, and this was the first place I had seen in years that felt like it might actually be all right. Like it might be possible to be all right if you could be somewhere this beautiful." She looked at him. He felt her looking but kept his own gaze on the water. "That is a very specific kind of comfort," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, "I thought you might know what it felt like." A long pause. The creek moved over its stones with the unhurried sound of water that has been moving in the same direction for 1,000 years and intends to continue. "I am from Cincinnati," she said. "I told you that, it was true. My father was a professor at the college there. He died 4 years ago and left behind a great deal of debt which I did not know about until after the funeral." She paused. "I had been teaching in a private school. I was good at it. But the school was associated with a social circle that my father had been part of, and when the debts came out and the house was sold and certain people withdrew their association, I lost my position." "I am sorry," he said. "I went to St. Louis," she continued, and her voice was measured and careful in the way of a person who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it cleanly. "I was engaged. His name was Robert Cartwright. He was kind, I thought. He had money and I did not, and I was 23 and frightened, and I thought that was a sufficient foundation." Colt waited. "It was not," she said. "He was not kind as it turned out. Or he was kind in the way that some men are kind when they are pleased and cruel in the way that some men are cruel when they are not." She was looking at the water now, and her voice was very steady. "I left. I left without telling him I was going. I took the train and I bought a new bonnet at the stop before Caldwell, and I decided to be someone else." He was quiet for a moment, sorting through what she had told him and what it meant. "Does he know where you are?" he said. "He knows I came west," she said. "He does not know which town. The name I am using is not one he would associate with me. Does he have the means to look for you?" "He has money," she said flatly, "which is the same thing usually." "Yes," he said, "it usually is." They sat together beside the creek for a while without speaking. He thought about what Me had said about everyone deserving a fresh start, and he thought about the look on Alina's face when she had walked through the schoolhouse for the first time, and he thought about the way she had laughed a few minutes ago on the sidewalk. "You are going to be all right here," he said finally. She looked at him, and he could see that she was weighing the statement, turning it over, testing its weight. "You do not know that," she said. "No," he said, "but I am inclined to make it true if it comes to that." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You are a very strange man, Colt Reeves," she said. "I have been told that," he said. She almost smiled. She was fighting it, he could see, the old caution coming back up like a tide. But it was there in the corner of her mouth, and he was patient. He drove her back to the boarding house as the sun was getting low, and the air was taking on the cold edge of a Kansas October evening. And she climbed down from the wagon and turned to thank him, and he touched his hat and said it was his pleasure and drove Priscilla back toward the ranch, thinking about the sound of her real name in his mouth and how much he wanted to say it again. The weeks that followed were good ones, by which he meant they were the kind of weeks that feel larger and more significant than their individual days can fully account for. He came into Caldwell regularly, more regularly than Dutch's errands strictly required, and he did not pretend to either himself or Alina that it was accidental. He would find her in the evenings sometimes at the boarding house sitting room, correcting papers or reading, and he would sit in the other chair by the fire and they would talk. She was extraordinary to talk to. That was the thing that undid him most completely and most gradually, like a fence post being worked loose by water over time. She had read broadly and thought deeply, and had opinions that were fully formed and clearly her own, and expressed with a directness that was entirely at odds with the careful social performance she had been trying to maintain. When she disagreed with something he said, she said so, and when he made her think of something new, she said that too. And by the end of October, he was arriving at the boarding house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, with the reliability of a man who has formed a new habit that he has no interest in breaking. Me noticed because Me noticed everything. "You are going to town a great deal," she said, setting a plate of pie in front of him one morning. "There are errands," he said. "Colt," she said. "Me," he said. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. "She is not entirely what she says she is," Me said. "I do not say that unkindly. I am very fond of her. I am simply noting it." "I know," he said. "Does she know that you know?" "Yes." Me looked at him steadily. "Are you being careful?" "No," he said honestly. Me looked at him for a moment longer, and then the corners of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one. "Good," she said, which was not what he had expected her to say, and she picked up the pie dish and went back to her kitchen. November arrived, and with it the first serious cold of the season, and also, unfortunately, the first complication. Colt was at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon when he saw the man come off the westbound stage, and something in his posture and the quality of his attention made Colt look twice. He was a city man, well dressed in the Eastern style, probably 40 or so, with a pale, well-maintained face and the air of someone accustomed to being accommodated. He was talking to the stage driver with the crisp, impatient manner of a man asking a question, and not expecting the answer to be unsatisfactory. Colt finished his business at the store and walked back to the wagon by a route that took him close enough to hear the end of the exchange. "I am looking for a woman," the man was saying. "Traveled west in September. Brown hair, medium height, well-spoken. She might be using a different name." The stage driver shrugged with the profound indifference of a man who encounters a great many people in the course of his work and retains specific information about none of them. "Can't help you," he said, and walked away to deal with the horses. The man stood on the street with his expensive bag at his feet and his jaw tight, and Colt took in his face and his clothing and his way of holding himself. And then he got in the wagon and drove directly to the schoolhouse and sat outside on the wagon seat until he heard the bell, and the children came streaming out, and Alina came to the door to supervise the departure. She saw him and knew immediately from his face that something was wrong. She dismissed the last child and came down the steps and stood beside the wagon without climbing up, scanning the street automatically. "He is here," she said. It was not a question. "A man came in on the western stage," he said. Well-dressed, Eastern accent, asking about a woman traveling alone who might be using a different name. She put her hand on the wagon rail and gripped it. He watched the fear move across her face and then watched her fold it back down with a deliberate effort that told him this was not the first time she had done that particular work. "Did he see you?" she said. "No. I do not think he knows anyone in Caldwell yet. He only just arrived." He kept his voice level. "Alina, I want to think through your options with you, but I need you to tell me something first. Is he dangerous? I mean physically. Is there any reason to think he would hurt you?" She met his eyes. "Never struck me," she said carefully. "But he is not a man who accepts being refused, and I left without his leave, which will have been experienced as a humiliation." She paused. "He will want to bring me back. Whether it is because he actually wants me or simply because I belong to him in his own accounting, I could not say." Colt sat with this for a moment. "You were not married to him," he said. "No, we were engaged. The engagement was announced in St. Louis society. My leaving broke that." "So he has no legal claim on you?" "No legal claim," she said, "but money has a way of creating its own laws." "Out here," he said with a quiet certainty that came from knowing this particular piece of country fairly well. "Out here, a man's money buys him a certain amount of comfort and very little actual authority." She looked at him. "What do you think I should do?" He had been thinking about this since the general store. "Do not change anything," he said. "Go to the boarding house as normal, have supper as normal, let him make the first move. The less unusual your behavior, the less attention you draw. And if he finds me, then we deal with it when he finds you," he said. "You are not alone in this town, Alina." She was very still. He could see the part of her that had been handling everything alone for a very long time, reluctant to accept the premise that she was not. "You do not have to take this on," she said. "I know," he said. "I am choosing to." Something shifted in her face, not the bright flash of earlier smiles, but something deeper and slower, the expression of a person who has been braced for a long time and feels something beginning to ease. She went to the boarding house. He did not follow immediately. Instead, he spent an hour re-establishing his presence at various points around town in the normal way of a man doing ranch business, so that his movements would not be unusual to anyone observing. He passed the saloon and saw the city man at the bar, nursing a whiskey and engaging the barkeep in conversation in a way that suggested he was asking questions. The barkeep, a large and largely taciturn man named Henry who had been in Caldwell for a decade and had developed strong views on other people's business, was responding with the minimal cooperation of a man determined not to be helpful without being outright rude. Colt went to the boarding house and found Alina in the sitting room with Mrs. Grundy, helping the older woman with a repair to the sitting room curtains, which was such a naturally domestic scene that it made him want to smile despite the circumstances. He sat down and accepted the coffee Mrs. Grundy pressed on him and told Alina quietly, "He is at the saloon asking questions. Henry will not help him. Most people in this town will not help him. But if he has your description and is willing to put money to it, it will only be a matter of time." Mrs. Grundy, who had been threading a needle with determined focus, said without looking up, "I do not know what you two are whispering about, but if there is a troublesome man in town looking for something he has no right to find, I would appreciate being told directly so that I can act accordingly." Alina and Colt looked at each other. "There is a man in town," Colt said. "He is looking for Miss Whitfield. He is from her past before she came west, and she has good reason not to want to be found by him." Mrs. Grundy looked up from the curtain. She looked at Alina with steady, calibrating eyes. "Has he any right to you, legally speaking?" she said. "None whatsoever," Alina said. Mrs. Grundy nodded. "Then he is a nuisance and not a legal matter. Good." She turned back to the curtain. "You will stay here, and if he comes to my door asking questions, I will tell him that I do not have a guest by whatever name he uses, and I will do so without the slightest discomfort because that will be entirely true." She paused. "Your real name, child? I assume the one you are using is not entirely it." Eleanor hesitated. Then she said, "Eleanor Ashworth." "Eleanor," Mrs. Grundy repeated, trying it. "That suits you better. Clara Me does not suit you at all." She bit off a thread with efficient finality. "Eleanor you shall remain, to me at least in private." That evening, Robert Cartwright walked down the main street of Caldwell making inquiries with the particular style of a man who believes his money and his affect will open any door. He had some success, because not everyone in Caldwell had Henry the barkeep's aversion to being helpful to wealthy strangers, and by nightfall he had gathered that there was indeed a new schoolteacher in town, a woman of approximately the right description, going by the name Clara Me Whitfield. Colt learned this from Bobby Teal, who had been in town visiting a girl and had been present for one of the conversations, and had the good sense to come and find Colt immediately. Colt thanked him and went to the boarding house and knocked and told Eleanor. She was sitting at the small table in her room when he told her, and she pressed her lips together and was quiet for a moment. "He will come to the school," she said. "Likely tomorrow morning," he said. "It is the most public place and the most socially conventional approach. He will not want to appear to be doing anything irregular." "No," she said. "Appearances matter very much to Robert." Colt was quiet for a moment. He was standing in the doorway of her room with his hat in his hands, and she was at the table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and he was aware, acutely and inconveniently, that he did not want to leave. "Eleanor," he said, "whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know something." She looked at him. "You do not have to go back," he said, "whatever he says or however he frames it. You do not have to go anywhere you do not choose to go. This is not a place where a man can drag a woman onto a stage against her will without consequence." She held his gaze for a long moment. Her eyes were very dark in the lamplight, and they were doing the complicated, layered thing they did when she was feeling more than she was yet willing to say. "And if he claims I owe him something," she said, "money or reputation or the engagement itself, then he can make that claim to a judge," Colt said simply. "Which I suspect is the last thing he wants to do, since it would require explaining publicly why a woman left an engagement so urgently that she did it without notifying anyone." She blinked. Something that might have been relief moved through her expression like a current. "You have thought about this," she said. "I think about most things," he said. "It is another habit." She almost reached out. He saw it, the faint movement of her hand toward the table's edge toward him, checked before it completed itself. But he saw it. "Good night, Colt," she said. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. He went to Dutch that night and explained the situation plainly and without omission. Dutch listened with the solid, unhurried attention of a man who has long since learned that the world is complicated, and the appropriate response is usually patience followed by decisive action. "What do you need?" Dutch said when Colt had finished. "I need tomorrow morning at the school," Colt said. "I may need you to speak for her character if it comes to it, you and me." "You have it," Dutch said immediately. "Me will want to come." "Me is going to want to come regardless," Colt said. "I just wanted to warn you." Me confirmed this the next morning at breakfast, appearing at the table in her good dress before anyone had said a word about the plan, with the composed expression of a woman who has decided a thing and is waiting for the relevant people to catch up. They drove into Caldwell together, Dutch and me in the front of the wagon and Colt on horseback alongside, and Colt went directly to the school while Dutch and me went to the Reverend Alcott's house. Eleanor was already there, and she had already opened the school for the morning, and the children were working at their slates with the industrious quiet that she had established in those first weeks. She looked up when Colt came in through the back, and her expression was tightly controlled. "He is across the street," she said quietly. "He has been there for 20 minutes. Colt went to the window and looked. Robert Cartwright stood on the opposite sidewalk in his city clothes, watching the schoolhouse with the patience of a man who has made up his mind about the shape of the morning. "All right," Colt said. "You go on teaching. I will be outside." He went out and leaned against the porch rail in the morning sun and waited. After a few minutes, Cartwright crossed the street. He was a better-looking man up close than Colt had expected, which somehow made the whole thing worse. He had a strong jaw and steady gray eyes and the kind of confident posture that takes years of social reinforcement to develop. "Good morning," he said, with the brisk pleasantness of a man doing business. "I understand there is a schoolteacher here, a Miss Whitfield. I believe I know her." "Miss Whitfield is teaching," Colt said. "School does not let out until noon." "I only need a moment," Cartwright said, moving toward the door. Colt did not move from the rail. He did not position himself aggressively or reach for anything. He simply did not move, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that communicated very clearly that the door was not currently available. Cartwright stopped. He looked at Colt with fresh appraisal. "I have no quarrel with you," he said. "I did not imagine you did," Colt said pleasantly. "I simply wish to speak with the woman inside." "She is busy," Colt said, "as I said." "And who are you?" Cartwright said, and his voice had a sharpening edge to it now. "Colt Reeves. I work for the Harmon outfit. We helped arrange Miss Whitfield's position here." "I see." Cartwright looked at him with careful eyes. "Well, Mr. Reeves, the woman inside is not Clara Me Whitfield. Her name is Eleanor Ashworth, and she and I have business to settle." "That," said a new voice, "would be a matter for Miss Ashworth to confirm or deny herself, and she is indisposed." Dutch Harmon had arrived, with me at his elbow and the Reverend Alcott slightly behind them, looking as though he was not entirely certain how he had come to be here, but was committed to seeing it through. Cartwright looked at them. He was outnumbered, which he clearly recognized, and more importantly, he was outnumbered by respectable people in a public setting in a town where he had no standing, which complicated matters considerably. "Eleanor left our engagement voluntarily," he said, making an adjustment in strategy. "I have come to speak with her, that is all. Surely a man has the right to seek a conversation." "He may seek it," me said calmly. "Whether he gets it depends on the other party's willingness, which you seem to be taking for granted." At which point the schoolhouse door opened and Eleanor came out. She must have sent the older children to watch the younger ones for a few minutes, because the room behind her continued its quiet industry. She came down the steps and stood on the ground in her practical gray dress and looked at Robert Cartwright with an expression that was very composed and very final. "Robert," she said. "Eleanor," he said, and something flickered in his face that Colt could not quite name. Reproach, hurt, wounded pride. All of them possibly in a mixture that was human and not entirely unsympathetic, but that was nonetheless beside the point. "I am not coming back," she said clearly. "I am not resuming the engagement. I am building a life here, and this is where I intend to remain." "You left without a word," he said, and the hurt in his voice was real. "Do you know what it looked like? Do you understand what was said?" "I understand that it was difficult," she said, with a composure that Colt found remarkable. "And I am sorry for the manner of it. I could not think of another way to do it, and I could not stay. You could have talked to me." "Robert," she said, "I tried to talk to you. On several occasions. You did not hear me." He was quiet for a moment. Colt watched the argument he had been carrying west with him deflate somewhat against the reality of her. He had come expecting to find a runaway who would be embarrassed and grateful and easily redirected. He had not, Colt suspected, expected this. "I could make things difficult," he said finally, and the words cost him something, because they were an explicit admission of what he had been implicitly relying on. "You could try," Eleanor said. "But I am in a town full of people who know me and respect the work I am doing, and you are a visitor from a city that is more than 1,000 miles away, and I do not think the difficulty would fall where you are imagining it would." Dutch shifted slightly behind her in a way that communicated without words the full weight of the Harmon outfit's agreement with this assessment. Cartwright looked at Colt, then at Dutch, then at me, then at the Reverend, and then back at Eleanor. He was not a stupid man. He read the landscape. "The ring was my mother's," he said after a long pause. Eleanor reached into the neckline of her dress and drew out the chain she wore there, from which the ring had been hanging. She unclasped the chain and held the ring out. He crossed the distance between them and took it, and for a moment they stood close, and Colt watched Alina's face and saw nothing in it that looked like regret for the man, only a kind of sorrow for the version of the story she had once wanted it to be. "I wish you well, Robert," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he closed the ring in his fist and walked back the way he had come without another word. Everyone stood in silence until he was gone. The Reverend Alcott cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "I believe school is in session." Alina laughed, a short, slightly overwrought sound of relief, and released tension and turned back to the steps. She paused at the top and looked back at Colt. "Thank you," she said, and then before he could answer she went back inside. He stood on the schoolhouse steps for a moment in the cold November sun, and Mia peered at his shoulder. "She did that herself," Mia said. "She did," he said. "You were just the scenery." "Necessary scenery," Dutch said from behind them. "Very attractive scenery," Mia agreed, and then walked away in the direction of Mrs. Alcott's house, where she intended to have tea, and left Colt standing on the steps with his face warm despite the cold. Cartwright took the eastbound stage 2 days later. Colt watched him go from the other end of the street and felt the particular clarity that comes when a complication resolves itself without further damage. He went to the boarding house that evening. Alina was in the sitting room reading, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way that was new, as though the last standing wall had been quietly taken down. "He is gone," Colt said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Grundy saw him leave." She set her book down on the table beside the lamp. "I feel lighter," she said, with a kind of wondering quality. "I have felt as though I was carrying something for so long that I had forgotten what I felt like without it." He sat down in the other chair and looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and the fire was warm between them. "Alina," he said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I have been coming into town twice a week for the past 6 weeks for no reason that has anything to do with Dutch Harmon's ranch," he said. "And I think you know that, and I think you have been kind enough not to mention it, and I would like to stop pretending that it is accidental." She was very still. "I'm not very good at the kind of thing this requires," he said, "in terms of the saying of it properly, but I am asking you, Alina, whether you would allow me to court you. Formally, if you prefer it that way, or informally, if you prefer that, but honestly either way." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had been calculating his character and his intentions and his trustworthiness since the first afternoon on the platform, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide from her and he wanted her to be sure of that. "You saw through me at the depot," she said. "I saw you," he said, correcting the phrasing gently. "There is a difference." Her expression shifted. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose there is. I saw a woman who was frightened and very brave and doing what she needed to do to get somewhere safe," he said. "And I saw that she was someone worth knowing. I have not stopped thinking that." She was quiet for a long moment. He did not fill the silence, only waited. "Formally," she said at last, "if you please, I would like it done properly." "Properly," he said, and something loosened in his chest that he had not realized was tight. "All right." He called on her the following Sunday afternoon after church, arriving at the boarding house with his hat cleaned, and his boots in their best state, and a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Mia had assembled with the brisk competence of a woman who has been expecting this moment for some time. Mrs. Grundy let him in with the approving expression of a woman who takes propriety very seriously and is pleased to see it being observed. They walked along the creek road in the Sunday light, the same road he had driven her down in October to show her the pool in the cottonwoods, and the trees were bare now but still beautiful in the particular way of things that have shed their decoration and are left with their essential structure. "I want to know more about you," she said, when they had been walking for a little while. "I have told you more than I have told anyone in a very long time, and I realize I know relatively little about Colt Reeves." "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said simply, so he told her. He told her about growing up in Missouri with a father who drank, and a mother who had died when he was 9, and the years after that which had been hard in ways he had not understood until later because he had had no basis for comparison. He told her about leaving at 15 and working his way west doing whatever was available, which had included things he was not proud of alongside things that were simply honest labor. He told her about arriving at the Harmon outfit at 17 and Dutch giving him work without conditions, and me feeding him the first real meal he had had in months, and how he had cried about it in the barn that night where no one could see him. She listened with the quality of attention that was her particular gift, and when he finished she said nothing for a moment, only put her hand through his arm in the natural way of a woman walking with a man she trusts, and he felt the warmth of it through his jacket sleeve. "We have both been frightened for quite a long time," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think that is exactly right. And we are both somewhat better at it now," she said, "at being frightened and continuing anyway." "That," he said, "is possibly the most honest definition of courage I have ever heard." She looked up at him, and her face in the winter light was so genuinely beautiful that he had to look away for a moment at the bare cottonwood branches, because looking at her directly for too long still did something to his equilibrium that he had not yet fully learned to manage. December arrived, and the courtship continued with the formal propriety she had asked for, and the complete mutual understanding beneath the formality that made it more rather than less romantic, because the propriety was a frame for something they both knew was already there. He called on her twice a week at the boarding house, and on Sundays they walked, and on the other evenings she sat in her room in the lamplight and he thought about her with an intensity and a sweetness that were entirely new experiences for him. He kissed her for the first time on the 23rd of December, standing on the boarding house porch after a Sunday walk, and it was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and she had been laughing at something he had said about Priscilla's documented disapproval of snow, and the laugh was still on her face when he stopped being patient and put his hands on her face and kissed her. She kissed him back immediately and completely and without hesitation, both hands gripping the front of his jacket as though she intended to keep him there. When they finally separated, her eyes were bright and her cheeks were pink from the cold and from something else, and she looked at him with an expression that was wholly unguarded and wholly joyful. "I have been waiting for you to do that for quite some time," she said. "How long?" he said. She considered it with the air of a woman going back through a precise mental record. "The creek, in October," she said. "When you told me about coming to the ranch at 17, that was when I knew I was in very significant trouble." He laughed, which was its own kind of relief, and she laughed with him, and they stood on the cold porch laughing together until Mrs. Grundy opened the front door with a lantern and said, crisply, that it was cold, and if they had finished their walk perhaps the porch was not the ideal location for an extended conversation. Christmas was celebrated at the Harmon Ranch, to which Eleanor was invited as a matter of course by me, who had stopped asking anyone's permission for her hospitality decisions approximately 30 years ago. It was a warm, crowded occasion, with all the ranch hands present and several neighbors and the Reverend Alcott and his wife, and me produced food in quantities that seemed physically improbable given the size of the kitchen. Eleanor wore a dress the color of deep winter berries and helped me in the kitchen with an ease and pleasure that suggested she found the domestic companionship genuinely restorative, and Dutch Harmon watched her help his wife, and then looked at Colt with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has seen a situation developing for some months and is pleased with the direction it appears to be heading. After supper, when the dishes were washed and the younger hands were playing cards and Dutch had fallen asleep in his chair, and me was knitting in the settled way of a woman who has ensured everyone else's comfort and can now attend to her own, Colt and Eleanor sat together on the bench on the porch, wrapped in a blanket that me had handed out to them with the casual inevitability of a woman producing the exact right thing at the exact right moment. The Kansas sky in winter was something extraordinary. The cold sharpened it, and the stars were so numerous and so bright that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. "I am happy," Eleanor said, with the wondering quality of a person saying something true that they had not expected to be able to say. "So am I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the cold and the starlight, and neither of them said anything for quite a long time because nothing needed to be said. He proposed to her in January. He had been thinking about it since December, but he wanted to be sure, and he wanted her to be sure, and he wanted to wait until she had settled fully into the life she was building, so that she would know the answer she gave was from a secure place rather than a frightened one. He did it properly, meaning he had a conversation with Dutch and me first, not because he required their permission, but because they were the closest thing he had to family, and he wanted them to know. And me made a sound that was not quite a sob and went immediately to the kitchen to do something with her hands, which was her way of processing significant emotion. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in January, at the creek in the cottonwoods, which had become their place in a way that felt permanent and decided, the water running low and gray under a cold white sky, and the bare trees standing around them like witnesses. He did not get down on one knee because the ground was frozen, and the gesture would have taken longer to execute than its sentiment deserved. But he took her hands in both of his, and told her that he loved her, which was the first time he had said it plainly, and which caused her to make a sharp intake of breath that she was clearly not expecting. And then he told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her if she would have him. That he understood she had come west to start over, and he was not asking her to give up anything she had built, only to let him be part of it. She was crying before he finished, which alarmed him briefly until he saw her expression, because the crying was not sad crying, it was the kind of crying that happens when something very long-held releases. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course. Colt, yes." He gathered her into his arms, and she put her face against the front of his jacket, and they stood together beside the gray January creek, while she cried a little and then laughed at herself for crying. And he held her and pressed his lips against the top of her head, and felt something in him settle into its final, permanent place. They were married in March, when the first green was beginning to show at the creek edges, and the weather had decided to be reasonable. The Reverend Alcott officiated with genuine warmth, and me cried openly without apology, and Dutch shook Colt's hand for a long time without saying anything and did not need to. Alina had written to her only living relative, an aunt in Cincinnati who had known her mother well, and the aunt had written back with a warmth that suggested she had been worrying about Alina for some time and was enormously relieved. The aunt could not make the journey west, but she sent a wedding present that arrived by post just before the ceremony, a set of silver-backed hairbrushes that had belonged to Alina's mother, and which Alina held for a long time when she opened the box, her face very still and very open, before she placed them carefully on the vanity in the room that was now going to be hers and Colt's. They moved into a small house that Colt had been building since November with the help of Bobby Teal and a couple of other ranch hands who were willing to donate Sundays to the project. It was not a grand house, but it was solid and well-made and warm, with 2 rooms on the ground floor and a sleeping room above, and a kitchen that me had helped design for practicality. It sat on a piece of land Dutch had deeded to him as part of his wages from the previous years, a gesture Dutch made with the same quiet simplicity with which he made most significant gestures, simply handing Colt the deed one morning over coffee and going back to his eggs. Alina loved the house. He could tell from the way she moved through it in those first days, touching the window frames and the mantelpiece and the kitchen shelves with a particular quality of attention. The way you touch something you are learning is yours. The school continued through the spring and into the summer, and Alina's reputation as a teacher grew until families were sending children from outside town, from farm holdings a half-day's ride distant, because word had spread that the school in Caldwell had a teacher worth the journey. The girl she had predicted at the very beginning, Ruth, was exactly as remarkable as Alina had seen immediately, and Alina was teaching her things that went beyond the standard curriculum, because the child's capacity made the standard curriculum seem like a shallow dish. Colt worked the ranch through the spring trailing season and came home to her in the evenings, and found that coming home to Alina was the best part of every day, better than the work and better than the satisfaction of the work, and better than the clear Kansas evenings and the stars overhead, because she was always there with the lamp lit and some project of her own underway, and she would look up when he came in with an expression that told him she had been waiting for it. They talked at the supper table every evening. This was the thing that continued to astonish him, that after months of it, he had still not run out of things to say to her, and she had still not run out of things to say to him, and the conversations were different every night, ranging across everything from the day's small events to large philosophical questions that she had been thinking about in the schoolroom and saved for him, and he thought sometimes that this was the thing he had not known to hope for. This specific intimacy of two people who genuinely wanted to know what the other was thinking. She told him things gradually, over the course of those first months. She told him about her father, the professor, with the complicated love she bore for a man who had been brilliant and warm and completely irresponsible about money. She told him about teaching in Cincinnati, which had been genuinely joyful before it ended, and about what it had felt like to watch her life there dissolve as the debts came out. She told him about Robert Cartwright, more than she had told him on the Creek Road in October, and he listened to all of it with the patience and the careful attention she had first offered him, and which he had learned from her. He loved her. It had been true since before he admitted it to himself, probably since the creek in October, possibly since the wagon seat coming from the station, possibly since the platform where he had watched a frightened, brave woman in a new bonnet pretend to be someone else with everything she had. In the fall of their first married year, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, before he had fully woken up, in the matter-of-fact way she had of delivering significant information, which he had come to understand was how she managed the things that made her most vulnerable. He was standing at the stove and she was at the table, and she said, "Colt, I believe we are going to have a baby." And he turned around and looked at her, and she was watching him with the careful quality she still occasionally reverted to, assessing his reaction, braced for something. He crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms, and she made a small sound against his shoulder that was relief and happiness in equal measure. "Good," he said against the top of her head. "Good. That is exactly right." The baby was born in June of 1884, and was a boy, which Colt announced to Dutch Harmon with the dazed expression of a man who has just witnessed something extraordinary and has not yet fully recovered his equilibrium. They named him James, after Alina's father, which was something she had to think about for a while before deciding, and which she cried about briefly after deciding, and which felt right in the way that naming something after someone complicated always feels both painful and true. Me was at the house for the birth and remained for a week after, managing the kitchen and the baby in Colt's state of overwhelmed helplessness with the easy authority of a woman who has been managing things for decades. She taught Alina what needed to be learned and told Colt what needed doing, and sat in the rocking chair with James in the evenings sometimes, and sang to him in the low, tuneless way she sang, which was not beautiful but was warm, and which James appeared to find entirely satisfactory. Alina returned to the school in September, and the community, which had by this point developed a genuine appreciation for what she had built, rallied to make it workable, with me taking James 3 mornings a week and Mrs. Grundy, who had not actually retired from anything she found interesting, taking him the other 2. Alina nursed him at noon and came home in the afternoons, and the arrangement was imperfect and occasionally chaotic and completely functional. The school by the fall of 1884 had grown to the point that there were serious conversations about adding onto the building, which would require a community effort similar to the one that had built it originally. Alina drove this conversation with the organized patience of a woman who has learned that the right way to move a community toward a thing is to make the thing seem like the community's own idea. Colt watched her do this at a town meeting in October, making her case and then listening, and then incorporating what she heard and redirecting the conversation by degrees toward where it needed to go. And he was aware, not for the first time, of how formidable she was. The frightened woman on the platform in 1882 had not been a lesser version of this woman. She had been this woman under difficult conditions, which was, he thought, the truest test of what a person was made of. The addition to the schoolhouse was built in the spring of 1885, again by community effort, and Alina attended the building days when she could, bringing food and water and her steady, organizing presence, and James, who was nearly a year old, watched the proceedings from a blanket on the ground with the interested expression of a child who is filing everything away. Life in Caldwell moved with the particular rhythm of a frontier town finding its permanent shape. The trailing season each year brought its chaos and its income and its complications, and in the quieter months the town built and settled and deepened. Families who had come west on uncertain foundations put down roots that were now past uprooting. The next generation of children in Alina's schoolhouse had been born here, to parents who still carried other places in their memories, but who had already begun to belong to Kansas in a way that would shape everything that came after. Dutch Harmon slowed down gradually, which no one who knew him would call a failure, because he had built something real and had the sense to let the people he trusted take it forward without fighting the process. He handed more of the outfit's management to Colt over the years that followed with the same quiet directness he had always had, and Colt took it with the same quiet seriousness, and between them it happened without drama, which was how both men preferred it. Alina continued teaching until James was 2.5, at which point she made the decision, which she arrived at herself and announced to Colt over supper one evening in the matter-of-fact way she announced most significant decisions, that she was going to find a capable assistant to take on more of the day-to-day instruction while she focused on the curriculum and the upper students. This was a decision born entirely from her own reading of what the school needed rather than from any domestic pressure, and she executed it with the same organized patience with which she executed everything, identifying the assistant, a young woman named Martha who had come to Caldwell with her farming family and had been one of Alina's first students years earlier, and training her over the course of a fall semester until the arrangement was working well. The letter from the aunt in Cincinnati arrived one spring morning in 1886 and caused Alina to sit quietly at the kitchen table for a long time with it in her hands. The aunt was elderly and not well and wanted to know if Alina might be able to visit before the summer. It was not a demand and not quite a request, more of a gentle inquiry from an old woman who was thinking about time. Alina brought it up that evening, and they talked about it for a long time, and it resulted in the first extended trip either of them had taken since the beginning, Alina and James on the train east to Cincinnati, while Colt managed the outfit and wrote letters that arrived in Cincinnati with a regularity that Alina read to James as bedtime stories, editing the content as needed. She was gone for 3 weeks, and when the train pulled back into Caldwell Station in the early afternoon, and he saw her come down the steps with James in her arms and a quality of settled peace on her face that had been building since she left but was fully complete now, he thought that she had done something important on that trip, closed something, returned something to its rightful place, and that she was coming back not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was unambiguously, permanently, and happily where she belonged. He took James from her arms so she could use both hands to hug him properly, and James accepted the transfer with his characteristic philosophical equanimity, and Alina put her arms around Colt's neck and held on for a long moment in the noise and bustle of the Caldwell depot, where 3.5 years earlier she had stepped off a train with a new bonnet and 3 lies already formed. "Hello," she said, her face against his jaw. "Hello," he said. "Welcome home." "Is Priscilla well?" she said. "Priscilla is unchanged," he said. "She remains opinionated, and she would like you to know she disapproves of your extended absence." Alina laughed, and James laughed because she laughed, and they walked together through the depot and out into the bright Kansas afternoon. The years that followed were full ones. A second child came in the autumn of 1887, another boy, whom they named William, and whose arrival James received with the generous curiosity of a child who has been well loved, and therefore has enough love available to spare for a newcomer. William was a different character from James entirely, louder and more demanding, and in possession of opinions about everything, which Alina observed with fond amusement, and which reminded Colt, though he did not say so, of a particular woman in a blue traveling dress who had arrived in Kansas with a great deal more going on inside her than she was permitting to show on the surface. Ruth, the formidable girl Alina had identified in her first week of teaching, did in fact become formidable on schedule. By the time she was 20, she was running the town's small library, which Alina had campaigned for and helped establish. And by 25, she had moved to Wichita, where she eventually became the first woman on the board of a significant institution, which Alina heard about through correspondence and reported to Colt over supper, with the satisfaction of a person who has been proven correct about something important. The school grew further, eventually requiring a second teacher in addition to Martha, which made Alina privately very pleased and publicly very focused on the practical management of the expanded program. She continued to shape it and guide it and invest in it with the passion she had always had for the work, the genuine passion that was there even underneath the borrowed name on the first day, the thing that was real in her when everything else was invented. Mee Harmon died in the winter of 1889, quietly, of old age, which was the most honest description of it, and her passing left a particular shape of absence in the lives of everyone she had taken care of over the years, which was most of Sumner County. Her funeral was the largest the Reverend Alcott had conducted in his time in Caldwell, and Dutch sat in the front pew with the composed, inward expression of a man who is holding something enormous very carefully. Alina sat with Dutch every Sunday for the following year, and Colt came home from the ranch some evenings to find her at the Harmon kitchen table talking with the old man, and he was profoundly grateful for her capacity to do that, to sit with grief and not try to fix it, only to be present with it. Dutch sold a portion of the spread to Colt in 1890 on terms that were significantly more generous than any market calculation could justify, and Colt built a somewhat larger house on the additional land that Alina had opinions about the design of and which turned out to be exactly right, with a window in the kitchen that looked east toward where the cottonwoods grew along the creek, which Alina had specified as a requirement, and Colt had understood immediately. James grew into a serious, gentle young man who looked like a version of Colt with Alina's eyes, which was something Colt noticed with a particular, quiet astonishment every time he looked at his son. James had his mother's patience and her capacity for careful attention, and by the time he was 7, he was reading things that most adults in the county had not read, which Alina found naturally gratifying and which Colt found naturally wonderful. William grew into precisely the person James's quieter temperament seemed to have created space for, full of energy and humor, and an appetite for horses that manifested early and never diminished. By the time he was 6, he was following Colt around the ranch with the intent focus of a child who has identified his vocation, and Colt taught him things with a patience that came easily because the teaching was a genuine pleasure. A third child arrived in 1891, a girl this time, whom they named me without discussion, and with total certainty, which made Dutch, when he heard the name, put his old face in his hands for a moment and not speak. Baby Me was the sunniest of the three, with a disposition that suggested she had arrived already at peace with the world, and she was welcomed by her brothers with the particular protectiveness of boys who do not know where it comes from but feel it absolutely. Alina's aunt in Cincinnati died in the summer of 1892, and Alina received the news in the measured way she received most difficult things, allowing herself to feel it, and then writing in her journal for a long evening, and coming to bed afterward with the quiet, composed expression of a woman who has laid something to rest properly. She had come such a very long way from the platform. That was the thing Colt thought sometimes, sitting across from her at the supper table with the 3 children and the lamp lit, and the Kansas evening outside the window. How far she had come and how much of the journey she had done under her own power, which was what he loved most about it. She was not here because of him, not exactly. She was here because she had gotten herself onto a train going west with a borrowed name and a new bonnet and a refusal to stop, and he had simply been at the other end, waiting on the platform, paying attention. He had seen her. That was the thing she kept coming back to, years later, when she thought about the beginning of them. Not what she had been pretending to be or what she was trying to hide, but herself, the actual person underneath the performance, the frightened and determined and deeply capable woman who had been carrying too much for too long. She had not known, at the time, whether being seen was safe. She had spent so long in the company of people who either did not look closely or looked closely for the wrong reasons, that the experience of being genuinely seen had been disorienting, and then frightening, and then, gradually, slowly, the best thing that had ever happened to her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked one evening, catching her at the kitchen window with James's atlas open on the table and the expression on her face that meant she was somewhere else. "The depot," she said. He came to stand beside her, his hand warm on her shoulder. The very first day, she said. "The new bonnet, the wrong name." "You were magnificent," he said. She looked at him. "I was terrified." "I know," he said. "That is what made it magnificent." She put her hand over his on her shoulder, and they stood together at the kitchen window looking out at the cottonwood line along the creek and the deep blue of the October Kansas sky. And in the sitting room James was reading to William, and little Me had gone to sleep on the floor with her head on the dog, and the supper was warm on the stove, and everything that had been broken or frightened or lost had been, over the long careful years, made whole. She turned from the window and looked at her husband, this particular man who had stood on the platform in his battered hat and paid attention when no one else would have, who had carried her valise and offered her the truth of a creek in autumn light, and stood at the schoolhouse door without moving, who had said her real name before she had given him permission, and made it sound like something she wanted to hear again. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, in the way she had learned to say plain things, without the old caution, without bracing for the consequence. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that had been hers since the beginning. "I know," he said. "And I love you. I have loved you since a woman in a new bonnet answered to a name that wasn't hers and almost fooled me." "Almost," she said. "Almost," he agreed. She laughed, and it was the full, unguarded laugh, the one that had started coming more easily over the years and now came naturally and without hesitation, the laugh of a woman who has nothing left to hide and every reason to be happy. Outside, the Kansas autumn was doing its extraordinary thing with the light, pouring gold across the dry grass, and setting the cottonwood line along the creek into deep relief against the sky. The same sky that had been there when she stepped off the train in 1882, and would be there for every season that followed, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in its vast, unconcerned way. And inside the house with the east-facing kitchen window, the sound of children's voices and the smell of supper, and the warmth of 2 people who had found each other in the oldest way, by paying attention, filled all the space that fear had once occupied and left no room for it, not even in the corners, not even on the hardest days. The depot at Caldwell had seen a great many arrivals and departures. Families going west, Fortunes being made and lost. Stories beginning and ending at the edge of the platform where the train slowed to a stop and possibilities presented themselves or slipped away. It had seen a woman in a new bonnet step off a train one autumn afternoon with 3 lies already formed behind her teeth, and it had seen a man with a battered hat pay the kind of attention that changes everything. What followed from that moment was not a simple thing and not a perfect thing, but it was a true thing, built from honest materials over honest years, and it held. It held very well indeed.